Russia today has much in common with the Soviet Union. Despite the still relatively open borders and mostly functioning online technologies, censorship, total ideological brainwashing starting from the kindergarten, and persecution of the opposition are making a huge comeback. One of the things that echoes the Soviet policy is the persecution of religious minorities. The Soviet Russia was formerly atheistic, hence every religious community was persecuted at some point, including the Orthodox Church and all forms of Islam. However, since the mid-1940s, the most significant and obedient communities were legalized and since then faced much less discrimination and harassment. As I have told before, the Russian Orthodox Church and two unions of evangelical Christians were basically reinstated on the state's terms. The Soviet Union had a very liberal constitution, on paper of course, and to display the proclaimed freedom of consciousness and to release possible tensions with still large parts of population that were religious, there were several ways to worship God and be more or less tolerated by the state power. In the Putin's Russia, the situation is similar. The difference is that the Orthodox Church is not just tolerated but largely supported by the state power. Even though, as I always claim, her political influence is quite limited, the Church dominates the religious market and sets up rules for most of other communities. The only notable exception is Islam, which is the majority religion in several powerful regions and among certain influential political circles. So what about persecutions? Are all alternatives to the Russian Orthodox Church persecuted? Well, not exactly. The Russian state today pretends to be even more liberal and free than the Soviet constitution allowed for. Hence, even more religious diversity is needed. The regime, however, cannot afford open opposition and disobedience, and there are strict criteria about which religious communities will be tolerated and which won't. The criteria are simple. First, the community should be obedient. This is mostly enforced through the recent legislature that regulates missionary activities, the recruitment of new converts, and state registration. Second, the community should not have powerful connections abroad, and especially it could not be dependent on them. This is implemented through the anti-extremist laws. With these two in mind, we can see the reasons for a relatively short list of tolerated Christian minorities. The unions of Baptists, forcefully centralized and controlled by Stalin, registered Pentecostals, Adventists, one recognized All Believers Church, and some traditional but insignificant groups like Catholics and Lutherans. All these groups have showed obedience in the form of either support or distancing from expressing any coherent position on the war in Ukraine. Many other communities face intimidation and legal action for their worship practices, missionary activities, and foreign connections. The brightest example of that is the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, who have their spiritual center in the US and who reject many expressions of the state, such as military service and political symbols. Another example is constant pressure on unregistered Pentecostals and Baptists, whose worship services are interrupted by the law enforcement, premises and property seized, and leaders arrested. Interestingly enough, the persecutions use practically the same formulations as their Soviet predecessors: agents of the Western influence, extremists, and totalitarian sects. Please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. I see you all next time.